The room was dead quiet as Bradley Thornton held up a single sheet of paper like it was contaminated. He smirked around the conference room table, his tight designer shirt straining against his chest. He looked at the other engineers, expecting them to join in his mockery of my back-end documentation. But nobody laughed. I kept my expression completely flat, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Inside, I was counting to 10. It was my third week back at Vertex Systems after leading a critical migration project for our largest client, and this was my first team meeting with the founder's son. Bradley had recently been installed as our chief strategy officer, a position he received solely due to nepotism after running 2 previous startups into the ground. He could not write code. He had no understanding of systems architecture, and he did not comprehend the development tools we use daily. Yet, he possessed an endless supply of arrogance and a desperate need to show everyone who was in charge. I had been with Vertex Systems for 6 years. My name was not on the main investor slides or the marketing decks, but my fingerprints were on every single server, database schema, and deployment script. I had built the back-end infrastructure from scratch. I had designed the automated deployment pipeline that kept our software releases running smoothly. When an API security vulnerability threatened a massive leak years ago, it was my emergency patch that saved the company from a devastating class action lawsuit. Everyone in the office knew I was the one who kept the lights on. Whenever something broke, they did not call the executives, they came to my desk. Bradley, however, did not seem to understand this, or perhaps he simply did not care. At first, I tried to ignore his condescension. I wore my patience like a shield, focusing on my work. I had code to write and servers to monitor, and I believed that his posturing would eventually burn itself out. But Bradley did not stop there. He began inserting himself into architecture reviews and sprint planning sessions, making ridiculous suggestions. During one meeting, he looked me in the eye and casually mentioned that they would eventually rebuild the entire platform from scratch with younger developers to bring in fresh energy. I remained silent, smiling politely. The other engineers in the room looked horrified by his ignorance, but Bradley remained oblivious. If you have ever had to sit in a meeting and listen to someone who could not configure a local development environment explain how to build a scalable system, you know the frustration. It is a slow, quiet heat that builds in your chest. It is the realization that the executives who sit in the corner offices have no idea how much work goes into keeping their business afloat. Bradley's behavior only grew worse as the weeks went on. He stopped referring to me by my name, Oliver Vance, in meetings. Instead, he started calling me the vendor. He would turn to me with a smirk and suggest we get the vendor's opinion on whatever buzzword-heavy idea he had just read about online. He once tried to convince the product team to turn our primary logo into a digital token, showing how disconnected he was from the actual business. I found myself working double hours, not only managing my own responsibilities but also quietly fixing the broken code written by the junior developers he hired. One of his Wyatt Gentry, had previously sold fitness applications and had no understanding of basic database constraints. I spent 3 straight nights rewriting Wyatt's database logic to prevent a production crash. I stayed because I believed in the engineering team and the product we had built long before Bradley arrived with his father's money. But everything changed when a junior project manager accidentally at Crassi sent me a copy of the new investor pitch deck. I opened the file while waiting for a compilation to finish. As I scrolled through the slides, my stomach dropped. Slide after slide displayed my architecture, my database schemas, and my scaling strategies. But my name was nowhere to be found. Instead, the slides were filled with phrases like proprietary technology, in-house innovations, and exclusive company ownership. I checked the edit history of the document and saw that Bradley had personally revised it multiple times, adding a quote about strategic leadership. I did not yell or throw anything. I simply closed my laptop, walked around the block to cool down, and returned to my desk. I realized then that this was not just a lack of respect. It was an intentional attempt to erase my contributions and claim my intellectual property. I was going to make sure that decision became the most expensive mistake of Bradley's career. The next time I saw the presentation, It featured the logos of three prominent venture capital firms and a title about scaling proprietary cloud infrastructure. I laughed quietly to myself. Bradley could not explain the difference between a load balancer and a database index, yet he was presenting my work as his own creation. The critical moment arrived on a Monday morning during a meeting in our cold whiteboard-lined conference room. Bradley walked in wearing a fleece vest, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He announced that we had received strong interest from three major investment groups, including Orbis Strategic Capital. He bragged that they loved the technology. When I asked if they had questions about the back-end architecture, he dismissed me immediately, stating that the investors were interested in the vision, not the code, and that they could always hire younger engineers to rewrite it later. He did not even look at me. I sat silently, clicked my pen 3 times, and wrote a single word on my notepad: war. The rest of that Monday passed in a blur of meetings and forced enthusiasm. Bradley Thornton walked the office corridors like a man who had already secured his fortune, talking loudly about exit strategies and alignment workshops. I ignored the noise, focusing on completing my tasks, but once I got home, the quiet of my apartment allowed my doubts to creep in. I sat on my couch with a glass of cheap whiskey, staring at the ceiling. The phrase the vendor kept repeating in my head. What if I was wrong? What if I had signed an agreement years ago that transferred all my rights to the company? I had been so focused on building the product in the early days that I might have overlooked a legal document. During the first few months of Vertex Systems, we were working out of a small garage, fueled by caffeine and excitement. The physical environment of that garage was chaotic: empty boxes of pizza, old monitors flickering in the dark, the constant hum of cooling fans, and the smell of cheap engine oil from Roger's lawnmower. I was coding 14 hours a day, balancing the startup work with freelance projects to pay my rent. I remembered signing papers on the hood of a car and at greasy diner tables where the lighting was so poor I could barely see the text. If I had signed away my rights during that chaotic period, I had already lost before the fight even began. To stop myself from spiraling, I called Wallace Higgins. Wallace was my mentor during my first engineering job, a brilliant veteran who had spent decades building robust database systems. He was now retired, spending his time reading and occasionally advising younger engineers. I expected him to offer some comforting words, but instead, he gave me a harsh reality check. I could hear the soft clinking of his ceramic mug as he sipped his tea, the sound grounding me in the reality of the situation. He told me to stop being polite and to check the actual paperwork. He pointed out that if I built the core system before the company was even incorporated, and if I had not signed a formal assignment agreement, then the technology belonged to me, not the company. He warned me that people like Bradley counted on engineers being too polite or too insecure to stand up for themselves. He told me that the moment Bradley called me a vendor, the relationship was over, and I needed to protect my creation. His words snapped me out of my anxiety. I hung up the phone, opened my laptop, and accessed the state intellectual property database. I filtered the records by my name and the year 2020. There it was. Registration hash 1043 EZ2020, filed on March 3, 2020. The title of the filing was Modular Cloud Microservice Backbone for Scalable Web Infrastructure, and the sole owner listed was Oliver Vance. There were no transfers, no joint ownership agreements, and no amendments. Next, I looked up the incorporation records for Vertex Systems. The official incorporation date was March 18, 2020. This meant I had registered the intellectual property 15 days before the company legally existed. Because we were moving so fast in the early days, the legal details had been ignored. We never hired an actual intellectual property lawyer back then, and we never drafted any post-incorporation assignment contracts. I had simply kept working, and everyone assumed the company owned everything. Now, that oversight was my primary leverage. The realization brought a sense of absolute calm. I was not going to storm into the office or make threats. Instead, I began building a comprehensive legal dossier. I spent the next 2 weeks gathering every piece of evidence I could find. I exported Git commit histories from my personal repositories, showing that the core modules were written before the company was formed. I saved Slack messages from the early days where I explained the system architecture to the founders. I gathered Trello cards, whiteboard photos with timestamps, and even screen recordings of early system demonstrations. I wanted to ensure that my paper trail was completely bulletproof. Searched through old hard drives stacked on my desk, looking for early drafts of the database schemas. I found backup files from my private server, dated weeks before our official launch. These files contain the exact structural design that now powered our production environment. I also found email chains where the founder, Roger Thornton, thanked me for working through the night to build the prototype, explicitly referencing my personal ownership of the code before we formed the corporation. I organized these documents into folders, labeling each one with its corresponding date. I copied everything onto a portable solid-state drive that I kept locked in a drawer, and I uploaded a backup copy to an encrypted cloud drive. I was building a solid foundation of evidence, ensuring that my claims were supported by facts. The office of my attorney, Zachary Miller, was located on the high floor of a quiet building downtown. The air inside smelled of eucalyptus and paper. Zachary was in his late 40s, with a calm voice and sharp eyes. He listened to my story and reviewed the summary page I had prepared. He did not seem surprised. He told me that startups failing to secure proper intellectual property assignments from their founders was a common issue. He explained that many companies assumed they owned everything created by their employees, even if the work was completed before the business was officially incorporated. Zachary stood up and walked to the large window, pointing toward the skyscrapers that housed the venture capital firms. The wooden cabinets behind his desk were filled with thick binders, each containing details of past legal victories and client records. He explained that these firms are terrified of legal entanglements. They want clean transactions where everything is signed, sealed, and delivered. If they see even a shadow of a dispute over the core technology, they will run away. He explained that a confirmation of ownership with the USPTO acts like a loud alarm in their database, warning them that someone else holds the key to the vault. Zachary advised me against launching an immediate lawsuit. He explained that litigation would be expensive and could drag on for years. Instead, he suggested a more strategic approach. He proposed filing a formal confirmation of ownership with the United States Patent and Trademark Office. This filing would reaffirm my status as the sole proprietor of the technology and create a public time-stamped record. He explained that when Orbis Strategic Capital conducted their due diligence for the acquisition, their legal team would inevitably check the public registry. The moment they saw the ownership discrepancy, the acquisition would halt. It was a clean, quiet play that did not require me to make a scene. I agreed to the plan, and Zachary completed the filing. Over the next 2 weeks, I continued to show up to work and perform my duties. I approved code changes, monitored system performance, and even fixed a major routing bug that Wyatt Gentry had introduced. I behaved as if nothing had changed, but I kept my eyes open. I documented every time Bradley claimed the technology was proprietary during investor calls. I saved copies of the presentation slides and noted his public statements. Bradley remained completely oblivious. He interpreted my quietness as submission, believing that I had accepted my role as a replaceable vendor. He continued to boast to the team about the upcoming acquisition, telling everyone that we were on the verge of a massive payout. He spent his days in meetings with investment representatives, talking about synergy and scaling, while having no idea that the foundation of his deal was resting on a document with my name on it. My preparations were complete. I had my documents organized, my legal filings recorded, and my backup secured. I did not feel any anger or desire for revenge. I felt a sense of professional clarity. I had built the technology, and I was simply ensuring that the law recognized my ownership. The company had chosen to treat me as an outsourced resource, and now they would have to deal with the consequences of that choice. During this time, the development team was under immense pressure to prepare the system for the technical review. Bradley kept demanding that we run performance tests and clean up the database. I did my job, ensuring that the system remained stable, but I did not offer any extra assistance. I knew that the code they were testing was legally mine, Every time I merged a pull request or resolved a server issue, I was simply maintaining my own property. I spent my evenings reviewing the codebase, checking for any changes that Bradley's new hires might have made to the core modules. I discovered that while they had written several superficial features, the entire structural foundation of the platform remained untouched. The database migrations, the API routing, and the caching logic were exactly as I had designed them 6 years ago. I documented these findings, creating a line-by-line comparison between my original prototype and the current production environment. This comparison proved that the company was still relying on my intellectual property to function. I sent the comparison report to Zachary, who added it to our legal file. Wyatt's code was a complete mess, filled with basic syntax errors and infinite loops that would have locked up the database under any real traffic load. He had copied code from public forums without understanding how it interacted with our caching layer. It was like putting a lawnmower engine into a commercial jet. I had to manually trace the transaction logs, rebuild the database tables, and refactor the entire payment endpoint to ensure our users could still complete their purchases. I kept a detailed log of every hour I spent repairing his mistakes, noting how my original architectural rules were violated by his changes. It was a warm Tuesday morning when the confrontation finally happened. I was at my desk, reviewing a database migration script, when the elevator doors opened, and Bradley Thornton marched into the engineering room. His face was red, and he was holding a stack of printed emails. He walked directly to my desk, ignoring the other developers who immediately stopped talking. He slammed the papers down next to my keyboard and demanded to know why I had been communicating with a lawyer using my company email address. The silence in the engineering pod was heavy. Bradley's face was contorted with anger, his breathing shallow and rapid. He pointed his finger at me, accusing me of disloyalty and acting against the company's interests. The other developers, who had worked alongside me for years, sat in stunned silence. Sean Finch stared at his screen, his knuckles white as he clenched his hands, while Chloe Brooks stood near the coffee machine, watching in absolute disbelief. Bradley's voice echoed through the open-plan office, drawing the attention of the product managers and designers who were working down the hall. They peered through the glass partitions. Whispering among themselves, I did not flinch. I pointed out that the email thread was from several weeks ago and that I had simply copied my personal email address to ensure I had a record of the conversation. I remained calm, which seemed to make Bradley even angrier. He began shouting, telling me that I was creating liability for the company and that my services were no longer required. He told me that I was fired, effective immediately, and ordered me to pack my things and leave the building. I did not argue or try to explain my position. I did not ask about my severance pay or my rights. I simply stood up, picked up the small blue flash drive that sat under my monitor, and placed it in my pocket. The drive did not contain any company source code, only my personal records and documentation. I closed my laptop, put on my jacket, and looked at Bradley. He asked if I needed security to escort me out of the building, and I told him that would not be necessary. I walked out of the room, feeling a strange sense of relief. An HR assistant met me near the exit with a small cardboard box, but I declined it. I did not have any personal items left at my desk. Everything that belonged to the company remained there, and everything that belonged to me was already gone. I walked out the front doors and stepped onto the sidewalk. The sun was shining, and the street was busy with people going about their day. I felt completely light, as if a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I walked down the steps of the office building, feeling the cool morning air on my face. The contrast between the chaotic shouting in the conference room and the calm street was striking. I walked slowly, not wanting to rush, taking in the sights and sounds of the city. I saw people drinking coffee at outdoor tables, checking their phones and walking their dogs. It was a normal Tuesday for them, but for me, it was the start of a completely new chapter. Within an hour, my phone began to buzz with messages from my former colleagues. Sean Finch, one of the senior developers, asked what had happened and if I was planning to sue. Chloe Brooks from Support Operations sent a message expressing her anger at how I had been treated. Even Wyatt Gentry sent a text saying he did not understand the details, but was sorry to see me go. I did not reply to any of them. I went home, poured a glass of water, and sat on my balcony. I knew that Bradley was already telling the executives that I was dead weight and that my termination was necessary for the company's growth. He would claim that the legacy back-end code was easy to replace and that they would hire younger developers to rebuild it. Let him talk. He had no idea that Orbis Strategic Capital was currently reviewing the legal documents for the acquisition, and that their lawyers would soon discover the public filing. At the Patent and Trademark Office, I spent the afternoon walking through the park near my apartment, enjoying the quiet. I had spent 6 years working late nights and weekends to build Vertex systems, often sacrificing my personal life to ensure the company's success. Now, that chapter was over, and I was looking forward to what would come next. I knew that my technology was secure, and my lawyer was ready to handle the legal discussions. The silence that followed my departure was not a sign of defeat. It was the calm before the entire deal fell apart. As the evening arrived, I received another series of messages from Sean. He told me that Bradley had held an emergency meeting with the engineering team, assuring them that my departure would not impact the development timeline. Sean said that Bradley had laughed during the meeting, claiming that I was just a vendor who had overstayed his welcome. I smiled as I read the message. Bradley was convinced he had won, completely unaware that his actions had just accelerated the destruction of his acquisition deal. I turned off my phone, enjoying the quiet of my apartment for the first time in months. The call came on a Saturday morning, just as Zachary Miller had predicted. The caller identified himself as Stephen Reynolds, an attorney representing Orbis Strategic Capital. He explained that they were conducting the intellectual property due diligence for the acquisition of Vertex Systems and had found a public filing listing me as the sole owner of the core platform technology. He asked if I would be willing to answer a few questions regarding the ownership of the back-end infrastructure. Stephen asked me to walk him through the timeline of the development. He was particularly interested in the date of my initial commit to the public repository, which occurred weeks before Roger registered the LLC. I explained the technical details of the architecture, explaining how the microservice backbone routed requests and handled load balancing. Stephen listened carefully, typing notes as I spoke. He seemed impressed by the level of detail I provided, acknowledging that my records were far more comprehensive than the files Vertex Systems had submitted. I agreed to speak with him, ensuring that my tone remained professional and objective. I confirmed that I was the original creator of the technology, and that I had registered the intellectual property on March 3, 2020, before the company was incorporated. I explained that I had never signed any assignment agreements transferring the rights to Vertex Systems. Stephen thanked me for my time and ended the call. I could tell from his tone that the acquisition was in serious trouble. The final meeting took place the following Tuesday. It was a video conference with the founders, the executives, and the legal representatives from both sides. Roger Thornton, the founder, and his son Bradley were present, looking confident. But the atmosphere changed the moment Stephen Reynolds shared his screen and pointed to the public registry file, showing my name as the sole proprietor of the technology. Bradley tried to dismiss the filing, claiming that I was just an early employee and that the company automatically owned the code. He argued that they had modified the system significantly since then. But Stephen was prepared. He explained that they had run a technical audit and found that 47% of the current production code base was identical to my original prototype. He stated that under Section 204 of Title 17 of the United States Code, any transfer of copyright ownership must be in writing and signed by the owner. Without a signed assignment agreement, any claim of ownership was void ab initio. He told the executives that without legal title to the core platform, the acquisition could not proceed. The risk was too high. The Orbis team then exited the call, leaving the Vertex Systems leadership in complete silence. The deal was dead. The aftermath was swift. The news of the failed acquisition spread quickly through the tech community. Within a week, the board of directors removed Bradley from his position as chief strategy officer, and his father Roger was forced to step down from active management. The company was facing a major crisis, as they could not run their service without using my technology. A few days later, I received a call from Beatrice Cole, the company's new legal representative. She was polite and sounded exhausted. She asked if I would be willing to sign a licensing agreement that would allow them to continue using the core infrastructure. She offered a significant sum of money, but I refused. I told her that the price had gone up, and I demanded 3 times their initial offer. She hesitated, but she knew they had no choice. They agreed to my terms. We met at a neutral office to sign the agreement. I read the contract carefully, ensuring that my rights were fully protected. Her hand was steady as she signed her name, but I could see the slight tension in her jaw as the ink dried on the paper. When I finished signing, I pushed the papers across the table and told Beatrice to let Bradley know that I did not hold any grudges, but I did hold the receipts. I walked out of the office into the afternoon sun, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. I had not destroyed the company, but I had reclaimed what was mine. I had stood up to their arrogance and used the law to protect my work. I now had financial security, legal recognition, and a new position as an independent consultant. I was ready to build something new, and this time I would make sure my name was on the contract from the very first day. I watched from a distance as Vertex Systems began its long reorganization. The company had to scale back its operations, and several of the managers Bradley had hired were let go. My former colleagues like Sean and Chloe remained at the company, and they told me that the atmosphere had improved significantly now that the nepotism was gone. I felt a sense of closure, knowing that I had resolved the conflict without resorting to anger or personal attacks. I had simply let the law do its job, and in the end, the truth had prevailed. I began receiving inquiries from other firms in the industry, asking if I would be interested in consulting for their infrastructure projects. My name had become associated with clean, scalable back-end design and a strong understanding of intellectual property rights. I accepted a few select projects, working from my home office on my own schedule. The financial security from the licensing deal allowed me to choose the work I wanted, focusing on interesting technical challenges rather than corporate politics.